That night, Jane Tanner, a friend dining with the McCanns, claimed she saw a man carrying a barefoot child in light-colored pajamas at 9:15 p.m. Her account quickly became the cornerstone of the abduction theory. Yet here is the critical point. No one else saw him. Not Gerry McCann, who stood just meters away, nor Jez Wilkins, who spoke with him on the same street. Only Jane. Later, police identified the man she saw as an innocent tourist with his own daughter. If Tanner was mistaken, her words didn't simply reveal the truth. They may well have constructed it. On the night of the 3rd of May 2007, the disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann transformed a family holiday in Praia da Luz, Portugal, into one of the most notorious mysteries of the 21st century. The McCanns, Kate and Gerry, both doctors from the United Kingdom, had traveled with their 3 children and a group of friends to the Ocean Club Resort. What should have been an ordinary evening ended with headlines that shook the world. Madeleine was missing from apartment 5A, a small ground-floor unit near the pool, and from that moment, every detail of the evening became a subject of intense scrutiny. To understand the centrality of Jane Tanner in this case, one must first look at the circle of friends known collectively as the Tapas 7. This group of British holidaymakers included couples and families with young children, many of whom had formed bonds through shared vacations. On the night in question, they dined together at the Tapas Bar, a restaurant within the resort complex. The arrangement was convenient, but has since become controversial. Each couple left their children asleep in nearby apartments and took turns checking on them throughout the evening. Does this system of intermittent checks by friends strike you as a reasonable holiday arrangement, or one that carries inherent risks that were overlooked? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. Jane Tanner was one of those friends. She attended dinner with her partner, Dr. Russell O'Brien, and their 2 young daughters, who slept in a ground-floor apartment not far from the McCanns. Within this circle, Tanner held no official responsibility beyond being another parent, another vacationer. Yet by the end of the night, her name would be etched into the official record as the only witness to a potential abductor. The reason Tanner's role became so critical lies in the nature of her claim. At approximately 9:15 p.m., she left the table to check on her children. As she walked along the narrow street near apartment 5A, she later told police she saw a man crossing the road holding a small child dressed in light-colored pajamas, barefoot, her limbs hanging loosely. This, she suggested, could have been Madeleine. No other member of the Tapas group, no resort staff, and no passing resident reported seeing such a figure at that time. Her account alone carried the weight of describing the moment Madeleine may have been carried out of the resort and into the night. But why did Tanner's statement rise above all others? The case itself lacked clear physical evidence. There were no broken locks, no forced shutters, no ransom notes. The apartment showed no signs of violent entry. In such an environment, where material clues were scarce, how much power does a single eyewitness account truly hold? Tanner's words offered investigators and the public something tangible, an image of a child in danger, taken by an unknown man. Her description provided both a narrative structure and emotional resonance. Without her, the notion of abduction would have rested only on Kate McCann's cry of, "They've taken her," a statement many might have dismissed as panic. Tanner gave that cry a visual companion. The fact that she was part of the Tapas 7 also influenced how her testimony was received. As a friend of the McCanns, she was close enough to understand the evening's dynamics, but not a parent directly implicated in the disappearance. This dual position, connected yet slightly apart, granted her words an air of credibility. She was seen as a sympathetic participant rather than a central figure. Yet her uniqueness also created problems. Tanner was the only one who saw this supposed abductor. At roughly the same time she placed her sighting, Gerry McCann was returning from a check on his children and had stopped to chat with another guest, Jez Wilkins, just meters from the very spot Tanner described. Neither Gerry nor Wilkins saw a man carrying a child. This presents a direct contradiction in the timeline, doesn't it? Was she the only attentive observer in that moment, or had she misinterpreted what she saw? When compared to the other members of the Tapas Seven, Tanner's statement stands apart. Matthew Oldfield, who checked the McCann children at 9:30, admitted he never looked closely enough to confirm Madeleine's presence. Russell O'Brien, Tanner's partner, was occupied with one of their own children who was unwell. Other members gave routine descriptions of dinner and casual conversation. Only Tanner introduced a new and dramatic element, a stranger in the night carrying away a child. In effect, her testimony alone injected the word abduction into the official narrative. This exclusivity is precisely why her account became the focal point of debate. Supporters of the abduction theory viewed her as the key witness. Skeptics, however, regarded her as the weakest link, pointing out that without corroboration, her words were simply that, words. Consider for a moment an alternative. Without this one statement, how might the initial hours of the investigation and indeed public perception have been profoundly different? If no one had claimed to see a man with a child, investigators would have faced a disappearance marked only by an open window and a missing girl. Theories might have leaned toward an accident or a child wandering off. Instead, Tanner's description redirected attention outward, toward the idea of an intruder, shaping not only the investigation but the global media narrative. Over time, doubts about Tanner's sighting would grow, yet in the immediate aftermath of May 3rd, her voice was elevated. She was not the first to raise the alarm, but she was the only one who provided the missing image, a man carrying Madeleine into the darkness. The evening of May 3rd, 2007 began like any other holiday night. Around 7 p.m., Kate and Gerry McCann put their 3 children to bed in apartment 5A. Madeleine, just 3 years old, was dressed in her pink and white pajamas, while her younger siblings, Sean and Amelie, were placed in their cots. The parents locked the front door, but deliberately left the back patio sliding door unlocked, believing it would make it easier to carry out the system of checking on the children. This decision, simple in the moment, would later be dissected endlessly. By 8:30 p.m., the adults gathered at the tapas bar. To reassure themselves, they created a rotation system. Every 20 or 30 minutes, one of the adults would quietly check on the sleeping children. The restaurant was only about 55 meters from the McCann's apartment, but the route was not a direct line of sight. At about 9 p.m., Gerry McCann excused himself to make his first check. He walked back to apartment 5A, entered and later reported that all 3 children were asleep. He noticed the bedroom door was more ajar than before, but thought little of it. After adjusting the door, he left. On his way back, he encountered another guest, Jeremy "Jez" Wilkins. Gerry and Wilkins stopped on the street just outside the apartment block and began talking. Their conversation would last for several minutes. It was during this exact window, around 9:10 to 9:15 p.m., that Jane Tanner left the tapas bar. It was her turn to check on her own 2 young daughters sleeping nearby. Tanner walked up the narrow street toward the apartments, passing on the opposite side of the road from Gerry and Jez, who were still chatting. According to her later statement, it was at this moment that she saw something unusual, a man walking quickly across the street holding a small child. She recalled that the child had bare feet and was wearing pale pajamas, her body lying limply in the man's arms as though asleep. The sight lasted only seconds as she continued on her way. The importance of Tanner's account lies in its timing. Gerry had just checked the McCann children at 9:05 and insisted Madeleine was asleep. Kate would not return to the apartment until 10 p.m., when she found her daughter gone. Tanner's sighting at 9:15 offered a possible explanation of what had happened in the meantime. To the police and the media, it looked like the missing link. Madeleine alive at 9:05, an unknown man carrying a child at 9:15, and a disappearance discovered by 10 and Kroc. Yet this pivotal observation was also filled with contradictions. The most obvious was that Gerry McCann and Jez Wilkins, standing only a few meters from where Tanner placed her sighting, saw nothing. How is it that two men facing the same street could completely miss a figure that would become so central to the entire case? For investigators, this discrepancy raised immediate questions about visibility, perception, and reliability. Meanwhile, back at the tapas bar, Kate McCann remained at the table with the rest of the group, unaware. She would not leave to perform her own check until the top of the next hour. The group's rotation system, casual and poorly coordinated, meant that each parent operated independently. Could this lack of synchronization have contributed to the critical gaps in the timeline that police later struggled to fill? Pinpointing Tanner's sighting is possible only because of the overlap with Gerry's check and his meeting with Wilkins. If Gerry entered the apartment at 9:05 and then spent about 5 minutes talking outside, he would still have been in place by 9:10. Tanner left the restaurant around that time and walked past them. That is when she said she noticed the man with the child. The implication is that the abductor, if one existed, must have slipped by within a 2 or 3 minute window while Gerry was preoccupied. Does this narrow time frame seem plausible for a planned abduction, or does it suggest something more opportunistic? For Tanner, it was a fleeting moment, but for the case, it became monumental. She did not stop the figure, nor did she mention the sighting immediately when she returned to the restaurant. Only later, after the alarm was raised at 10 p.m., did her observation become central. The timeline of that night, reconstructed through countless interviews, narrows into this one critical hour between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m. Within that hour, the case shifted from a routine holiday to a global mystery, and at the heart of it, Jane Tanner's position stands out as unique. Her claim remains the only eyewitness description of an abduction in progress. Whether her memory was accurate or mistaken remains debated, but in the fragile timeline of May 3rd, her words filled the gap between Gerry's calm check at 9:05 and Kate's frantic discovery at 10 o'clock. In those few seconds on a quiet street in Praia da Luz, Jane Tanner provided the testimony that would define the case. When investigators began collecting statements, Jane Tanner's account stood out for its peculiarity. She did not run into the tapas bar at 9:15 to raise the alarm. Instead, her words came later, woven into the confusion that followed Kate McCann's discovery. This delay would become one of the most troubling aspects of her testimony. Does a memory recalled only after a crisis has been declared hold the same evidentiary weight as one reported in the moment? According to her first formal statement, Tanner described the figure in remarkably simple terms. A man of medium build in dark clothing, walking quickly, carrying a small barefoot child in light-colored pajamas. She recalled the child's body seemed limp, as though asleep. The image was fleeting, a passing impression in the dim light. The significance of these details lies not only in what she saw, but in what she didn't. She did not describe the child's face and could not say with certainty if the carrier was male. The lack of precision was understandable, but for what was presented as the sole sighting of an abduction, the testimony seemed strangely muted. Equally striking was that when she returned to the restaurant, she mentioned nothing. To her, it was not cause for alarm. Only after Kate returned screaming that Madeleine was gone did Tanner's recollection surface. This sequence, an ordinary sight at 9:15, becoming a crucial clue after 10 o'clock, created a structural weakness in her testimony. Critics have argued that this allowed suggestion and hindsight to shape her words, that her memory may have adjusted unconsciously to fit the new, terrifying narrative. But what is the alternative? One explanation is that in a holiday resort, seeing a parent carry a sleepy child is not strange. The casual atmosphere could have made such a sight easy to dismiss. Another is social. She may not have wanted to interrupt Gerry and Jez's conversation, which seems more plausible, that the sight was so mundane it wasn't worth mentioning, or that the memory itself was constructed later under immense pressure. Her first statements to Portuguese police reflected this hesitancy. Her words were tentative, almost cautious. There is also the question of influence. By the time Tanner gave her statement, she had already been exposed to Kate's exclamation, "They've taken her," and the spreading panic. In this atmosphere of confusion, her sighting quickly took on a life of its own. Another layer of complexity comes from how her description evolved. Her earliest account was minimal. Later, more details appeared, like the pattern of the pajamas. This raises a difficult but vital question about memory. Where is the line between genuine recollection surfacing under questioning and unintentional contamination from external information? In the broader narrative of May 3rd, Jane Tanner's delayed statement filled a critical gap. Gerry's check at 9:05 suggested Madeleine was safe. Kate's discovery at 10 o'clock showed she was missing. Tanner's sighting at 9:15 offered a bridge between the two. Without her, the timeline would lack an external figure, leaving only speculation. With her, the abduction story gained a visual anchor. Yet, the very fact that she did not share this observation until after the alarm had been raised undermined its reliability. Her account entered the record late, and with it came questions about accuracy and influence, leaving open the possibility that Tanner had indeed glimpsed the truth, or that she had unknowingly helped to create it. When the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária, often referred to simply as the PJ, took charge of the Madeleine McCann investigation, they were faced with a storm of conflicting narratives. On one side stood the McCanns and their friends, insisting Madeleine had been abducted. On the other stood the Baron Apartment 5A, with no signs of forced entry. Into this tension stepped Jane Tanner's testimony. For the British media and supporters of the McCanns, it seemed like the crucial clue. For the PJ, however, it quickly became one of the most problematic pieces of the puzzle. Chief Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, the lead investigator, approached the case with the instincts of a seasoned officer who knew how appearances can mislead. To Amaral, the story of a stranger silently removing a child was possible, but far from convincing. The PJ's skepticism rested first on the lack of corroboration. From an investigator's standpoint, when two witnesses, Gerry McCann and Jez Wilkins, directly contradict a third at a potential crime scene by stating they saw nothing, how does one determine which account is reliable? Compounding this was Tanner's delay in reporting. She only spoke of it after 10 o'clock p.m. For the PJ, this was suspicious, suggesting her memory could have been shaped by the narrative already emerging. Is it more likely that a witness would delay reporting something truly shocking, or that the memory of an ordinary event becomes shocking only in hindsight? Amaral and his team also noted how Tanner's description evolved. In her first statement, she spoke vaguely of a man in dark clothes. Later, her account gained more detail, aligning it more closely with what Madeleine had been wearing. This raises a classic investigative dilemma. Does an evolving memory signify a witness recalling more detail or one unconsciously conforming to a narrative? The lack of physical evidence further undermined the claim. If a man had carried a child out of apartment 5A, investigators expected to find some trace. Instead, forensic teams found nothing. At what point does a complete lack of supporting forensic evidence begin to seriously challenge an eyewitness account? The PJ considered alternatives. Could Tanner have seen another tourist carrying his own child? This possibility gained traction months later when detectives identified a British holidaymaker who admitted he had been carrying his daughter from a nearby night creche at the same time. This man's description matched aspects of Tanner's sighting, leading Portuguese police to conclude her account may have had nothing to do with Madeleine at all. How profoundly can a simple, innocent coincidence alter the course of a major investigation? For Amaral, the implications were clear. In his later book, Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, he was explicit. He believed the McCanns had constructed an abduction story to cover up an incident inside the apartment, and Tanner's sighting had been absorbed into that story. This reframes the key testimony not as a clue, but as a potential component of a diversion, doesn't it? Within the investigative team, there was a strong consensus that Tanner's testimony lacked reliability. Experienced investigators found it difficult to believe a kidnapper would take such a risk, choosing the exact moment Gerry was nearby to make an escape. Moreover, the Portuguese police were aware of the media environment. British tabloids seized on Tanner's sighting as proof of abduction. What responsibility does the media have in such cases, and how can intense press coverage influence an investigation? Ultimately, the PJ reached a conclusion. While they could not prove Tanner was lying, they did not find her testimony trustworthy. In their view, it was either an innocent misinterpretation or a manipulated contribution. This widened the gap between the Portuguese police and the British authorities. To the PJ, Tanner's sighting symbolized the larger problem of the case, a reliance on inconsistent testimony rather than hard evidence. Years later, Scotland Yard acknowledged that Tanner's sighting likely referred to the unrelated tourist, supporting what Amaral had argued. For the PJ, it was a classic red herring, compelling enough to capture attention, but ultimately irrelevant to the truth of what happened to Madeleine. In the end, Jane Tanner's testimony illustrates both the power and the peril of eyewitness accounts. For the Portuguese police, it became an example of how a single statement, repeated and amplified, can dominate an investigation while offering little real substance. To Amaral and his team, Tanner did not provide the answer. Instead, she provided a distraction, one that allowed the abduction story to flourish, even as the evidence pointed elsewhere. Without her testimony, the disappearance might have been framed in far more ambiguous terms. The impact of her words on the official storyline cannot be overstated. They transformed a vague sense of loss into a plot with sequence and movement. The structure was simple but persuasive. Gerry McCann reported seeing Madeleine safe at 9:05. Jane Tanner reported seeing a man carrying a child at 9:15, and Kate McCann discovered her daughter missing at 10 o'clock. These three anchors created a timeline that appeared coherent. In the absence of forensic proof, this sequence provided the scaffolding on which the case was built. It is precisely this sequence that gave her testimony its power. But is it human nature to impose a simple, linear story on chaotic events? And what are the dangers when an investigation is built upon such a narrative? The neatness of this arc was also its weakness. Complex events rarely unfold with such tidy intervals. Does this neatness lend the timeline credibility, or does it, paradoxically, make it feel more like a constructed story than a reflection of reality? The importance of this timeline was that it appeared to lock in the time of the alleged abduction to roughly 9:15, allowing police and the public to narrow their focus. If her sighting was accepted as accurate, then speculation about other events could be dismissed. The disappearance became a problem of minutes, and those minutes belonged to Tanner's account. For supporters of the abduction theory, this timeline was invaluable. For critics, it looked too convenient. If Madeleine's fate had been sealed earlier, Tanner's words provided a way to shift suspicion by asserting she saw the child being carried away alive. The timeline itself acted as an alibi. Whether intentional or not, this functioned as a kind of shield for Gerry McCann in particular. His statement that he saw Madeleine safe at 9:05 could have been undermined, but with Tanner placing Madeleine alive in the arms of another person 10 minutes later, his role was reinforced. Her account not only created an abduction narrative, but also stabilized the parents' credibility within it. The strategic value of this was enormous. For the McCanns, Tanner's words provided external validation. They could point to their friend's testimony as independent corroboration. For investigators, however, this interlocking timeline was a double-edged sword. It gave structure to their inquiries, but risked narrowing their vision prematurely, sidelining alternative scenarios. What makes this more complex is the possibility that Tanner herself did not realize the strategic weight her words carried. But once those words entered the official timeline, they became the keystone in the construction of an entire theory. This leads to a far more unsettling hypothesis. What if her testimony was not a spontaneous recollection, but part of a prearranged narrative designed to protect the McCanns? This theory rests on the possibility that Madeleine's disappearance was the result of a tragic incident inside apartment 5A, which the parents and their friends sought to conceal. In such a scenario, Tanner's sighting becomes not a coincidence, but a calculated insertion. The sequence is so convenient that it reads like a scripted drama. If one entertains the possibility of a domestic accident, the motivation becomes clear. For the McCanns, the consequences would have been devastating: legal charges, professional ruin, and public condemnation. In the face of such outcomes, to what lengths might people go to protect their family? In this atmosphere, a collective decision could have been made to build an alternative narrative, shifting blame onto an external villain. Tanner's testimony was the linchpin of this construction. Without her, the abduction theory lacked a witness. With her, the void was filled. The possibility that her statement was shaped in advance is reinforced by how closely the other members of the Tapas 7 seem to align with her account. The uniformity of their stories has been interpreted by some as evidence of rehearsal. When a group of close friends faces a crisis, is it more likely for their individual memories to diverge, or for a single, harmonized account to emerge out of loyalty and collective shock? Critics point out that such harmonization may have occurred quickly in the frantic minutes after Kate shouted, "They've taken her!" If an accident had already taken place, this would have been the point at which their cover story had to solidify. This suggests Tanner's memory, introduced only after the alarm, could have been shaped not by shock, but by calculation. She may have known exactly what role she had to place Madeleine outside the apartment at 9:15, alive in the arms of a phantom abductor. If the group agreed to protect the McCanns, each member would have had a part to play. Together, their testimonies interlocked, creating a narrative so coherent that it resisted alternative explanations. From an analytical perspective, what is more suspicious in a group's testimony? Minor contradictions, which are typical of genuine memory, or near-perfect coherence? From this viewpoint, the case takes on the dimensions of a staged performance where the Tapas 7 are not simply witnesses, but actors. The weaknesses in Tanner's testimony, her delay, the lack of corroboration, the shifting details can all be reinterpreted. They are not signs of a faulty memory, but of a hastily assembled story. This reframes the evidence, doesn't it? Could the very inconsistencies in an account be interpreted as the fingerprints of invention? The implications of this theory are stark. If true, it would mean that one of the most famous child abduction cases was a carefully staged deception, and the Tapas 7 were participants in a cover-up. While a deeply disturbing thought, it forces us to confront a difficult question. In the pursuit of truth, should all possibilities, no matter how dark, be considered? In the unfolding mystery, two witness accounts stand out: the Tanner sighting at 9:15 p.m. and the Smith sighting at around 10 p.m. On the surface, both involve a man carrying a small barefoot child in light sleepwear through the streets of Praia da Luz. Yet beneath these similarities lie profound differences. Jane Tanner's testimony was the first to emerge, a fleeting, vague glimpse that became the linchpin of the abduction theory, placed neatly into the timeline. By contrast, Martin Smith and several members of his family encountered their sighting at around 10 p.m. Theirs was not the impression of a single witness, but the shared experience of several. The critical divergence came later. Months after the disappearance, Martin Smith stated that the man he saw reminded him strongly of Gerry McCann himself. This detail transformed the Smith sighting. If true, it raised the possibility that Gerry himself had been seen carrying Madeleine close to the time Kate raised the alarm. How should an investigator handle a witness statement that is both compelling, being a group sighting, and yet contains such an explosive, albeit uncertain, identification? Why then did the Tanner sighting dominate the headlines, while the Smith sighting was largely sidelined? The answer may lie in the intersection of media dynamics and investigative politics. British media outlets framed the McCanns as victims, and Tanner's sighting fit this narrative perfectly, conjuring the image of a prowler. Smith's testimony threatened to destabilize this narrative. The suggestion that Gerry McCann might have been the man seen would have cast a shadow over the grieving parents. As a result, the Smith sighting, though arguably more credible, received only muted attention. This suggests the story that gained prominence was not the one with more corroboration, but the one that was more narratively convenient. What does this tell us about the relationship between media coverage and the course of an investigation? This contrast underscores how narrative can eclipse evidence. Tanner's words, though uncorroborated, became the cornerstone of the official abduction timeline. Smith's sighting, by contrast, lingered in the shadows, too disruptive to the established story. This imbalance had serious consequences, funneling the search in a particular direction, away from domestic explanations. The juxtaposition raises unsettling questions. Was Tanner's testimony amplified not because it was stronger, but because it was more useful? Was Smith's testimony ignored not because it lacked merit, but because it threatened to implicate the wrong person? In the end, the Tanner and Smith sightings are less about what was seen than about what was believed. One vision became the cornerstone of the abduction story. The other, a disruptive alternative, was left on the margins. Together, they demonstrate not only the fragility of eyewitness testimony, but also the power of narrative framing. The haunting image of a man carrying a barefoot child may forever define the night of May 3, 2007. But whether that man was a stranger, a tourist, or even Gerry McCann himself remains one of the most troubling uncertainties of the entire case. The night of May 3, 2007 ended in confusion, but Jane Tanner's words would continue to echo far beyond the streets of Praia da Luz. What she claimed to have seen cast a long shadow over the international narrative of the Madeleine McCann case. But what is the long-term legacy of a single eyewitness account, and how does it evolve over time in the public consciousness? In the United Kingdom, her account rapidly became the centerpiece of public understanding. Newspapers seized on her image of the man with the child, splashing it across front pages. This raises a critical point about the media's power, doesn't it? Once a story is embedded in the public mind, how difficult is it to revise that initial impression, even when new evidence emerges? Her description fueled appeals, inspired e-fits, and kept alive the belief that Madeleine had been stolen by an outsider. Yet, as years passed, cracks appeared. Online forums developed entire subcultures devoted to scrutinizing the case, and Tanner's sighting became a lightning rod. For some, she remained the crucial eyewitness. For others, she became the embodiment of the case's inconsistencies. In the age of online sleuthing, a witness is no longer just testifying to police, but is tried indefinitely in the court of public opinion. What impact does this intense, often anonymous public scrutiny have on the search for truth? To supporters, she was vilified unfairly. To detractors, she was not just mistaken, but complicit. Her role did not end with the initial investigation. Over the years, Tanner has been a recurring figure in documentaries and books. Some frame her as a pivotal witness. Others, influenced by Gonzalo Amoral's perspective, present her as an unreliable narrator. This highlights how the same facts can be framed to support opposing narratives. As a viewer, how do we distinguish between objective analysis and a storyteller's persuasive agenda? Every anniversary brings fresh debate about Tanner. The psychological weight of this legacy should not be underestimated. The long-term consequences of her testimony are twofold. On one hand, her words kept the abduction theory alive, fueling an unprecedented media campaign. On the other, her testimony fractured public trust, giving rise to conspiracy theories. This presents a paradox. Can a single piece of testimony simultaneously fuel a legitimate search while also creating a smokescreen that obscures other possibilities? Ultimately, Jane Tanner's legacy is about the role a single testimony can play in shaping a global mystery. Her sighting remains both a beacon for those who believe she witnessed the truth and a shadow for those who believe she helped obscure it. The story of Jane Tanner reminds us how powerful a single voice can be, but it also offers crucial lessons. The first is that memory is fragile. Given the known fallibility of human memory, especially under stress, should an uncorroborated eyewitness account ever be the cornerstone of an investigation? The second lesson is about pressure. When the media demand answers fast, witnesses can feel forced to provide certainty, and those words can be treated as unshakable truth, causing other possibilities to be ignored. The third lesson is responsibility. Police, journalists, and the public must take care, as every rushed assumption can waste months of investigation. This places a responsibility on all of us, doesn't it? To question what we read, to resist conclusions, and to remember that every missing child deserves more than stories. They deserve the truth. The call to action is clear. If you see something, speak honestly. If you hear something, do not repeat it without care. If you read something, ask if it is supported by real evidence. Jane Tanner's role will always remain controversial. But beyond the debates lies the real message. One person's words can guide or misguide an entire search. If Tanner saw nothing at all, then the Madeleine McCann case has been carried forward by a story that was never real. And if that is true, the lesson is sharp. Never let a single voice silence the search for what really happened. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.